The beauty of watercolor is that you can take any familiar shape like a pumpkin and make it look completely different, not just by changing your colors, but by using a different technique. Today I will paint 3 pumpkins and show you 3 different watercolor approaches so you can discover which one you enjoy most. First, the blue pumpkin, very beginner-friendly 2-layer method that uses one special super granulating watercolor pigment. I'll show you the exact colors and brush movements that create this effortless texture. Next, the orange pumpkin, a classic glazing technique, slow transparent layers that build depth and beautiful shadows. This requires a bit more patience, and I'll walk you through each stage to show you how to avoid the common mistakes beginners often make. And finally, the white pumpkin, no white paint here at all. We will only work on the shadows to carve out a 3-dimensional form on paper. I love teaching this technique. It's perfect for any pale subject, from white roses to pale horses or sunlit buildings. Let's dive in and see how 3 popular watercolor techniques can turn a familiar pumpkin shape into something truly special. All materials I used are listed in the video description, along with a link to my reference photo. Just note that based on so many of your requests, I switched up the larger yellow pumpkin to a more exciting blue variety. We did something similar last year in a smaller composition, and now I can show you the full process again, plus much more. And if you like to follow the full drawing and the painting process in real time, this tutorial, close to 6 hours with extended narration, black and white outlines, and step-by-step photos, including the crab apples and the chestnuts, is our October tutorial on my Patreon. Let's start with the blue pumpkin. This one is always a favorite. I painted it last year, and so many of you asked for it again because of its stunning color and beautiful texture. The best part is this technique is actually very simple. We'll begin by preparing the paper with a very diluted wash of transparent blue. So use lots of water and just a hint of color. The goal here isn't to paint yet, but to wet the paper evenly and get it ready for the granulating pigment to do its magic. One thing to watch out for is your paper might start drying too fast. That's totally normal, so just work in smaller sections. Half the pumpkin at a time works perfectly, or just pick one of the slices. Once the paper is evenly damp and lightly tinted, it's time to introduce the star of the show, a super granulating blue. I'm using forest blue from Schmincke, but any granulating pigment will create that beautiful textured look. You want to drop the color gently into the wet areas, focusing on the shadows, so between the pumpkin segments and where the blue pumpkin tucks behind the orange and the white one. These special super granulating watercolor pigments contain heavier particles that move slowly across the wet surface, settling into the paper's texture and leaving a natural velvety pattern as they dry. Some will even separate into multiple colors. It's such a fascinating effect. Lots of brands offer super granulating colors. I love Schmincke and Daniel Smith. They both offer wonderful ranges, and I'll link them below if you like to explore. For the base blue, I'm using Phthalo Blue Green shade, a non-granulating transparent blue that keeps the highlights clean. You can use any smooth non-granulating blue for this initial stage. Just avoid granulating colors like cobalt or ultramarine, so your texture comes purely from super granulating color that comes later. Quick tip, if your paint label has a letter G, that means the color will granulate. To finish this layer, I'd like to drop in small touches of other hues, so a little bit of cobalt teal for that extra pop of vibrant green-blue, completely optional. I'm also adding some Hansa yellow and Quinacridone Scarlet to capture the warm reflections from the orange pumpkin at the front. And of course, I add dioxazine purple. It's my favorite accent, no matter what I'm painting. And here it ties the whole palette together because it will echo beautifully with the palette of the other 2 pumpkins that I'm going to show you in a minute. Now let's let this layer dry completely before moving on. In step 2, our goal is to enhance all that lovely texture underneath. So grab your transparent blue again, that same phthalo blue we used before, and make a very diluted mixture with lots of water. we're applying a sheer glaze over the top, so keep it light and transparent. I'm gonna show you up close. You want to hold your brush at a slight angle and gently drag it across the surface, creating soft, uneven circular strokes. Think of it as tracing the gentle bumps and curves of the pumpkin skin while skipping a few small spots to leave those highlights shining through. These irregular, wavy strokes help emphasize the natural form of the pumpkin. Don't worry about perfection, this technique actually looks best when it's loose and organic. Focus mainly on the shadowed sections around the stem, between the pumpkin ridges, and especially near the bottom where the blue pumpkin overlaps with the others. Leaving the light areas untouched will keep that beautiful contrast and sense of three-dimensional form. Before we move on to the next pumpkin, let's take a moment to finish the stem. The first layer I painted was just a light wash of ochre with a few drops of that same granulating forest blue at the base to anchor the color. Now I'm mixing forest blue with a touch of green to add texture. And using just a tip of your brush, you want to draw some lines following the natural direction of the stem. You can also soften a few edges with a damp brush to keep it soft and organic. For the final touch, let's add a few strokes of warm brown. This is my Quinacridone Scarlet. This brings a lovely balance between the cool blues and the greens and makes the stem feel alive and more dimensional. Now let's move on to the orange pumpkin, and this one is a bit more complex, so take a moment to study your reference first. Look for the main ridges and the areas of deepest shadow. We'll need at least 3 layers of color to capture all the subtle variations and soft glazed shadows at the end. For the first layer, let's start with a very light wash of yellow. Here I'm using Cadmium Yellow Medium Hue from Daniel Smith, but any yellow will work, just keep it very diluted and even throughout. While the paper is still damp, you can drop a few touches of orange to mark the darker spots, and even maybe a hint of violet or purple where you see the shadows forming. I'm using that same dioxazine purple again to echo the purple in the blue pumpkin. Keep everything very light at this stage. You should be able to see your pencil lines clearly through the paint. And once the first layer is completely dry, we can begin building up our color. So you want to add a small ring of green near the center of the pumpkin and then start deepening the orange tones. I'm using Hansa Yellow Deep from Daniel Smith, perhaps a bit too light, so any rich, transparent orange will work. Use whatever you have on your palette. You can think of this layer as about halfway up the value scale, so your paint is still watery, but more saturated than before. Focus your brush strokes on the lower left side at the base where the light doesn't reach, and add a few vertical strokes on the brighter side to follow the pumpkin's natural coloring in between the protruding ridges. Don't worry about the perfect detail. What matters most is the direction of your stroke. So notice the positioning of my brush. It's following the shape from the tip to the base. Even slightly uneven lines will end up looking natural if you keep your brush positioned that way. And to finish this layer, you can mix in a bit of that same dioxazine purple with a little bit of Quinacridone Scarlet or whichever brown you like. You can pick something like burnt orange and just lightly mark up the darkest creases and shadow edges. Keep these accents very subtle. We'll deepen them later in the final layer. So once your second layer is fully dry, I actually let mine sit overnight. It's time for us to do the final step, glazing the shadows. And I'm gonna use a mix of Quinacridone Scarlet and dioxazine purple again, but now make it stronger and darker. So around value 7 or maybe even 8 in some areas. This layer will define the form and cover any remaining pencil marks. Here are a few tips for this step. You want to observe your reference photo very carefully, and for softer, more realistic shadows, you can gently blend the edges of each shadow with a clean damp brush. Just make sure that the layer underneath is completely dry so you don't lift the underlying color. Another tip is to control the color temperature and add lots of visual interest. You can adjust your color mix. So you can add more scarlet for warmer, glowing shadows, or add more purple for cooler, deeper ones. This subtle variation in hue will really help you bring the pumpkin to life. And if you've been wondering why I waited until the very end to paint the shadows, this is exactly why. Separating color and shadow stages gives you so much more control, especially when you're still learning the medium. It lets us focus on one layer at a time and one job at a time. And in watercolor, that patience always pays off. Watercolor is a transparent medium, unlike many others, and that's exactly what makes it so special. By glazing our colors gently, one step at a time, we can build depth and realistic form while still letting the light shine through every layer. And finally, let's paint the white pumpkin in the center and talk a bit about how to approach white subjects in watercolor in general. In classic watercolor, we don't have white paint to fall back on like we do with oils or acrylics. So instead, we have to rely on the white of the paper itself and focus on painting only the shadows. That's exactly what I'm doing here, using the same shadow mix as I did on the orange pumpkin. It's Quinacridone Scarlet and Cyan Purple. But this time, my mix is very diluted, almost just tinted water. With a large round brush, I'm gently painting only the shadow areas between pumpkin segments and also along the bottom, leaving the highlights completely untouched and dry. Try to avoid using gray for white subject. Instead, use soft shadows tinted with color to keep the results bright and lively. In fact, notice that at the end of each segment, I'm also adding small color reflections to make it feel more natural. And that's because real shadows always pick up color from nearby objects. So on the left, you'll see some warm orange reflections from the pumpkin beside it. You can also observe it very clearly in the reference photo. And on the right-hand side, I've added subtle red tones from the crab apples that I've added to my composition. These small touches make the pumpkin feel grounded in its environment. Now I'll let this layer dry completely, and in the meantime, I'll add a bit of texture to the stem, again using the same method as I did on the blue pumpkin, mixing my forest blue from the blue pumpkin with a touch of green. And once everything is dry, we can add a few final touches, just deepening the darkest shadows to give the pumpkin more dimension and increase the contrast. You might be wondering why I'm not using white watercolor paint, because it does exist, but keep in mind that it's opaque, and that's the opposite of what we want, because watercolor medium is transparent, and that's where its beauty lies. When you add white pigment, it blocks the light and dulls the glow of the layers beneath, often leaving your painting looking flat or chalky. This is also why many lower quality student grade paints loaded with white and filler tend to dry pale and lifeless. So instead, let the paper itself serve as your brightest white and use water, not white paint, to lighten your color mixes. This transparency is what gives watercolor its sparkle, depth, and a sense of light. If you do use white pigment, save it for very special highlights, tiny accents rather than full areas. And in that case, white gouache or white acrylic works better anyway because it won't fade as much. As a finishing touch, I'm adding a soft cast shadow underneath everything using that same forest blue from the large pumpkin. A quick tip: to make white or pale subjects stand out, try to always frame them with slightly darker objects. So here the blue and orange pumpkins create a perfect contrast around the white, and if I didn't have them in the reference photo, I would add darker objects myself, and the same idea works on any subject. You can add darker leaves around a white rose or soft trees and clouds around a white building. Just remember, let the paper be your highlight. light. And if you like to explore more advanced techniques for painting white or very light subjects like negative painting and using masking fluid, check out this tutorial you see on your screen. It will help you avoid a lot of common frustrations and really understand how watercolor light works. Let me know what fall projects you're working on this season, and I will see you next week with more watercolor magic.